Hello, everyone, and welcome back to deucescrack.com. This is Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman back with the third episode of my series Good Bluff, Bad Bluff, where we talk about the deep meanings of what makes a bluff. And we go over some situations. We're sort of progressing through the course of a hand. We'll do a quick recap of what we did before, but the last 2 episodes ago in episode 1, we talked about kind of the fundamental theories behind what defines a bluff, making sure that our vocabulary is very solid. And then in the last episode, we talked a lot about pre-flop bluffing, what it meant to raise before the flop. And so sort of going through this, we talked about classic bluffs being betting to get your opponent to fold a better hand. So like if I have pocket sixes and you have pocket eights, can I get you to fold your hand? And then advanced bluffs being if I have pocket eights and you have pocket sixes, can I get you to fold your hand in a way that might be a mistake? Like let's say if you were getting really good odds, or if I would fold to a raise but you fold instead, or if you're not going to put any more money in the pot whatsoever unless you hit a better hand than I have. So those are some like versions of advanced bluffs. And we talked about how, in the grand scheme of sort of the distribution of hand strengths pre-flop, that generally when you raise before the flop, you're basically bluffing or you're semi-bluffing. So there's sort of a pretty narrow range of hands, somewhere between the top 5 and 10% of hands that are definitely value. They get called by more worse hands than they get called by better hands. Most everything else kind of ends up into this area of, slightly 50-50 or slightly lower than that in terms of hot and cold equity, where we really are bluffing. We talked about how player types matter a lot. We'll go more into that today, about how who we're playing against will be a big factor into whether or not our bluff is actually effective or not. And then last time we introduced thinking about ranges and thinking about those from the beginning of the hand. We will go into that into a little bit more detail today on the flop, but we talked about it a little bit last time in terms of pre-flop. So, okay. So today we're going to talk, the sort of subject of today's lesson is c-betting. So for whatever reason, c-betting has gotten itself a reputation as being different than other bets. People, obviously has a different name. I c-bet this, whereas I like bet the turn, or I bet the river, or I raise pre-flop, or I raise the river, or whatever. But like c-betting is like, it's c-betting. It's somehow different. So we'll ask the question, why do we c-bet? Is c-betting really so different from other bets at all? What makes a good c-bet and what makes a bad c-bet? And how do I play against someone with different types of c-betting strategies? Somebody who might c-bet a lot of the time, or somebody who might not c-bet all that often. Kind of what does it look like in general to be playing with c-bets and playing against c-bets? So today is everything you ever wanted to know in terms of c-betting theory. Or at least some of it. There's probably more to it than this, but that's okay. So, c-betting in general is standard. Now, last time we talked a little bit about how raising pre-flop was standard, and how people had sort of become comfortable raising pre-flop because they're in these passive games. But in truth, the raising pre-flop and the c-betting the flop are brethren. They are tied together. So, in a sense, raising pre-flop all the time wouldn't have been so good if people weren't folding to c-bets. And actually we see often kind of in like, mid and high stakes games that people who, that raising pre-flop becomes less and less and less good. The edge becomes much smaller. The less somebody folds after the flop, simply because you're not generating very much money to steal back for yourself later on, so to speak. And we'll sort of go through a couple of examples of how that sort of works. But in general, when we look through at things that are standard, almost every standard thing has its genesis in like the old-fashioned, very passive games. In fact, every time that we come up with something that is that is the new standard or differs from the past version of standard, it's usually because we've had to adapt to a more aggressive game, and that often has meant actually like less c-betting. So, in fact, it's like standard c-betting is sort of a remnant of an older era, but one that still sometimes comes into play. And so you've probably heard the advice from me and many other people not to bluff fish. But in truth, passive fish are very, very bluffable. In fact, they miss the flop a huge portion of the time, and when they do, they just fold. So those are the fish that I've written here were made to be bluffed. So in a sense, if you're playing small stakes, or even if you're just playing in a passive game, it could be any stakes really. Being able to c-bet the flop as a bluff is one of your most powerful tools, raising pre-flop and following up with a c-bet. But we have to make sure that we're judicious with it and we understand why we're doing it the way we're doing it. Because indeed, we are in fact bluffing these fish on the flop, but also we are not necessarily going to be bluffing them too often later on, although that's a subject for another day's discussion. So let's go ahead and walk through a little bit of simple math. So let's assume for just a second that there is a dead small blind. You can imagine this as being somebody who, let's say, folds 100% of cards, or maybe he posted his blind, but then he had to take a phone call, and so he left, and his blind is just out there. And let's assume that the big blind also never 3-bets ever because he's like extremely passive. This is obviously like a some big assumptions, but we're doing it to make our math as easy as possible. And again, I'm not like an amazing mathematician, so there's a decent chance that I screwed this up. So if I did, I hope someone will come and correct me in here. But I think it's right. Let's also assume, for example, that our opponent in the big blind is playing 40% VPIP. So this is not like a massive, like an enormous, ridiculous fish, but it's quite fishy. So what we find then is that 60%. Let's say also that we're going to 3x. So pre-flop we're raising to 3 big blinds. So if we raise to 3 big blinds, when he folds, which happens 60% of the time, we win 1.5 big blinds. So that's his big blind and the small blind that's out there. So in that sense, 60% of the time we win 1.5 big blinds. Now, the other 40% of the time he's calling because he's never 3-betting. That's one of our sort of basic assumptions. Obviously, we can make this math a lot more complicated if we choose to, but I'm just trying to prove a point, so I won't. If we were to then go ahead and bet 3 big blinds, so a half pot bet on the flop, or a slightly under half pot bet, I think I actually screwed this up, because I forgot to include the small blind again on the bottom, but I did screw it up. Dang it. Let's say that, for example, that this is going to be pretty close, but I'm annoyed now. Let's say that we, I remember what it is. They rake the half a big blind, let's say. There it is. Cool. Let's say that they rake the half a big blind. I knew that there was something in there that I was missing. So then we go ahead and c-bet half pot our 3 big blinds to win 6 big blinds. And let's just say that this works 2/3 of the time, which is roughly how often your opponent misses the flop, so to speak. Now, different definitions of missing the flop. Obviously, if your opponent was going to, let's say, call with any 2 overcards, it might be a wider range. Or if they're going to fold gut shots, it might be a narrower range. But let's just take 67% of the time. 2/3 is like a decent barometer of how often our opponent misses the flop and then decides to fold because this is a passive opponent who never bluffs. Okay, so what we have here is that 27% of the time, which is basically the equivalent of saying 2/3 of the remaining 40%. So 67% of that remaining 40% of the time, we're going to win 4 big blinds, which is the same thing as basically like whenever we win that, right? Actually, I think I did screw this math up, didn't I? Did I? No, I don't think I did. Okay, maybe I did, but the point will remain the same. Then, so we win. So our c-bet basically nets us there. This 4 big blinds essentially, and the other, let's just say the other part of it, the other like 13% of the time, we raise pre-flop, we get called, we c-bet the flop for half pot, and we get called again. And let's say that we always lose that when that happens. This net right here brings us out to a little bit over 1 big blind, 1.2 big blinds, just printing with any 2 cards for doing this, if you were to hold all these things steady. Now again, I think that I might have screwed up this last part of the math because I always am bad at math. But even so, it would actually, if anything, it would be, if I did screw it up, the number here would even be higher, but I don't think that I'm not entirely sure I screwed it up. But the point is that when you're up against an opponent who plays a strategy, and this is actually not that wildly different of a strategy from what most bad passive players are actually adopting, you see that you sort of inherently make a decent clip by raising on the button, let's say, to 3x, even if you assume that every time that you c-bet the flop and get called, no matter what you have, you lose that money, and you never, but let's also say you never put in any more money also after that. So nothing happens, the hand is over after the flop. This would be sort of that simple range idea we talked about, I think last time, maybe 2 times ago. But the math gets a little bit less simple when you take into account a couple of other things that actually end up being more or less to our advantage. So the biggest one is that you don't always lose when you c-bet the flop and get called. Obviously, sometimes we're going to hit the flop. Sometimes we'll have a very strong hand pre-flop, like aces, for example, will hit every flop. And so in that sense, and because you're also like going to be making better decisions than your opponents in general, that there's a lot of likelihood that your EV on turn and river is going to be absolutely incredible. So not only are you making a print from just your bluff on earlier streets, but there's a good chance that you'll either be able to bluff somewhat effectively on later streets, but more likely that you'll be able to just scoop giant pots by value betting really, really effectively. Now, obviously, there's other ways we can make the math more complicated, where if we were to say, okay, well, what if the small blind is there and they participate some X percentage of the time, and what if some Y percentage of the time the big blind does 3-bet, with like aces, kings, queens, something along those lines, and what if some percentage of the time our opponent does check raise the flop when he makes a good hand, or I guess that probably wouldn't make too much of a difference, but let's say maybe he does like donk the flop every once in a while. You could obviously make it very, very complicated if you wanted to, but the point that we're trying to prove is that according to these numbers, against kind of a similar strategy to one that a bad passive player might adopt, c-betting should be absolutely incredible and pretty much a dynamite way to make a ton of money. So the answer to that is, of course, it depends. So yes, against bad passive fish, this is an incredible strategy, and raising many, many cards, playing a really wide range, and c-betting a lot kind of has that fundamental structure that makes it really, really effective. However, some quote-unquote fish do not just fold to c-bets when they miss. So this is kind of the most commonly ignored problem with the massive c-bet strategy. And this was a thing that existed, even during the days of largely passive games. And the number one reason why is that these aggressive fish, these sort of bad aggressive players, were rare enough that you could just lump them in with the rest of them and keep c-betting. And even though that the c-bets were bad against that one player type, they were kind of great against everyone else. So you didn't really notice so much that c-bets didn't work so much against those people. And then also, even against bad aggressive, c-betting still works sometime. It just doesn't work nearly as often as it worked against that other group. And then last but not least, even though we are talking in a way that differentiates between sort of bad passive players and bad aggressive players, a lot of the regulars, in older times and even now, don't do an awesome job of differentiating between what types of fish they're playing against, who's actually likely to do what. And kind of with that in mind, it becomes harder to sort of adjust your c-betting strategy if you don't really know who you're playing against. So where does the c-betting strategy break down? Well, it breaks down when you're playing against, to start off with at least, when you're playing against somebody who is really, really, really aggressive and unlikely to fold even when they miss the flop. So what we find at the end of the day is that a c-bet is a bluff, just like anything else is a bluff. Even though it comes after you raise pre-flop and X, Y, Z things, it still has to follow the basic rules of bluffing, which is that your opponent needs to fold as a mistake for your c-bet to be good. This is an important sentence. Your opponent needs to fold as a mistake. If your opponent doesn't fold, the c-betting bluffing is not going to be good, the same way that a bluff on the river wouldn't be good against a giant calling station. If your opponent folds, but he folds lots and lots of things that are like things he's supposed to fold, then again, your c-bet doesn't do you a whole lot of good. And so let's go ahead and take a look at just a couple of examples here, and we can kind of see what I'm talking about. Okay. So the first example is that we raised Queen Jack of clubs in the cutoff, and a bad aggressive player calls us on the button. And the flop comes down, 8 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, 5 of spades. So we have no backdoor flush draws, we just have a couple overcards. Now, against a bad passive player, this would be a totally fine spot for us to c-bet because they're really likely to fold a hand like ace-10 or king-10 or king-jack or anything like that. Against a bad, and those are all obviously mistakes. Obviously, those are all better hands than us in the first place. But he might even fold things like pocket deuces or I guess that's still a better hand than us. He might even fold something like, you know, I don't know. Sometimes people, like bad passive players, even fold a hand like Jack 10 there, thinking that they don't want to chase a gut shot or something along those lines. However, if our opponent doesn't fold King 10 here, if our opponent looks at King 10 and decides that this is a good spot to raise, or this is a good spot to float, or to basically play back at us in any sort of way, then we start to have a problem with our basic idea of c-betting, that our opponent doesn't really care about the fact that we raise pre-flop. They're pretty much just playing their own cards. Now, that's a great thing against a passive opponent who's playing his own cards and just folding when he misses, but a bad thing against when playing against a bad aggressive opponent who's playing his own cards with the intent of not folding them very often. So in that sense, the bluff is a problem by the classic definition, in that our opponent's not really folding too many better hands. With a king, so the next example is, we raise pocket kings in the cutoff, and a bad passive player calls in the big blind. So now normally this would be a spot where c-betting would be incredible. It's against bad passive player and so on and so forth. Obviously we have kings. We're excited to try to get a lot of value. And then the flop comes down ace, deuce, deuce. So this is a spot where we could definitely c-bet, and our opponent would fold a huge portion of the time. But our opponent, in fact, doesn't really ever make a mistake by folding there. In fact, everything that he folds there is certainly going to be behind us, and many of those things are going to be drawing dead. Whereas every time that he calls, he plays correctly with either an ace or a deuce. So even though our opponent might fold a ton, it's never really a mistake. And this is a place that I would like sort of draw a quick aside, which is that there's a mental reinforcement aspect of c-betting too much and winning too many pots, but winning them incorrectly. So in a sense, if your opponent is drawing dead here, it's going to be, and he's passive, you should basically never lose the pot. He's not likely to run a big bluff with a hand like Jack 10. He's basically likely to either give up or maybe call one street if a jack or a 10 peels off, or maybe fire one really small pathetic quarter pot bet on the turn or something like that. But he's really unlikely to ever get you off your hand, so you can win this pot without betting. However, we get so used to being in this c-bet raise preflop and then c-bet mode, and we get a little bit of an endorphin rush every time that we get our opponent to fold and we win the pot, that we think that, okay, maybe this is actually a good thing that I'm c-betting here and getting my opponent to fold, but getting your opponent to play correctly is basically never a good thing. And that ends my aside. So I guess we have one more aside. We're going to touch on something really quickly, although this is something that's going to go maybe a little bit more into our discussion next video. But we again have to be thinking about things in more than just one street. So before we describe this as being the difference between a simple range and a complex range. So the simple range being, what is he going to do right now? And the complex range being, well, what's going to happen later? So just like a preflop bluff could be, let's say, bad just within that zone. Like, let's say if you were going to raise 7-8 suited on the button and get called by the big blind, who's a bad passive fish, even so, that's a fine, even though it's a bad bluff within the context of that street, because your opponent's never going to fold 9-7 or obviously never any ace or anything like that. It's a fine bluff in general because your c-bet's going to work 2/3 of the time, and we sort of went through the math of that a little bit. So c-bets can be the same way, where they might be bad on one street, but when taken into consideration with the rest of the remaining actions still to come, the c-bet itself might be bad within that street, but fine in the grand context of the hand. But that said, we're going to sort of touch on that later in a subsequent video still to come. Okay. So the first question we're going to deal with here is, how often should I c-bet? This is a question that most people for a long time didn't even think about, because it was just assumed that your c-bet percentage would be like very close to 100%. I know that sounds like total lunacy right now, but believe it or not, like the games were so passive that you just assumed that unless it was like a multi-way board and a really bad board, that you would just c-bet 100% of hands because you could have aces and the other guy couldn't. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. But now people have sort of come to grips with the fact that maybe they shouldn't c-bet all the time. So how often should you c-bet? And the first key to this is player type, player type, player type. So if you're playing against a bad passive player and you're heads up, it is quite reasonable to expect to c-bet very close to 100% of the time. That Kings example doesn't actually happen all that often. Much more likely that you are just in a position where you have like pocket sevens there and you want to c-bet for sort of bluffing to get your opponent to fold equity and all sorts of things similar to that. So in general, we would say if our opponent is bad passive, that should incline us to c-bet a ton. If our opponent is bad aggressive, that should incline us to c-bet quite rarely, in fact. Bluffing, well, again, because you're giving yourself generally a pretty good price, bluffing doesn't need to work that often. Against bad aggressive players, it really might not work often enough to make it actually function as a successful bet. So, when we think about, like, what it means to play against a bad aggressive player, trying to kind of bluff them out of really anything is probably not the right strategy in general. Then the last player type would be the sort of thinking players. And against those types of players, we want to be aggressive in lots of cases. But we'll sort of have to be conscious of our own ranges. And we'll talk about that again in just a moment here. So the first thing to consider when you're going to c-bet after player type, so if player type's number 1, this should be number 2, would be board texture. So this is sort of the fourth bullet point here is kind of tied to this idea of equity and sort of combining equity with board texture. Obviously, those things are going to be intertwined. So if the board is, if you're thinking about things in terms of complex ranges, and again, we're going to go into this more next time, but you would say, okay, well, is this board one that's likely to give me additional equity on later streets? And is this board one that's likely to increase my fold equity on later streets? And you would find that certain boards might be more conducive to increasing your c-bet percentage and other ones wouldn't. So to give you an example of what that might look like, if you had, let's say, 10-9 suited and the board came down 8-5-3, that might be a great spot for you to c-bet where you could feel comfortable barreling 7s, 9s, 10s, jacks, queens, kings, and aces potentially, as well as any backdoor flush cards. So that's a spot where you could potentially be quite aggressive. Whereas if the board had come down something like ace, jack, 6, even though you have, again, a number of cards that might make you open-ended straight draw on the turn, it's unlikely for the board to be to change as much to sort of allow you to continue being aggressive. So when you're not going to be able to continue to be aggressive as often, c-betting against players who fold less often, so against bad aggressive or against thinking players, becomes less effective in general because they're sort of already not planning on folding too often, and now there's not going to be a lot that's going to be able to change and make them think that you actually have a stronger part of your range. This third bullet point is really important. I wrote, beware of unbalance. So what does that mean? So I want to sort of reflect back again for a moment on the idea of, like the old idea in passive games of, okay, I'm going to c-bet 100% because I raised pre-flop and my opponent didn't re-raise, so therefore I can have aces and he can't. This would actually be connected to the idea of like a capped range, right? The problem with this against a thinking player is that let's say that you open the button with 100% of hands as a hypothetical and your opponent calls in the big blind. He knows that you can have aces. That's true. But he also knows, and that he probably can't. But he also knows that you have like 96 or 99.6 other things that are not aces 99.6% other things. And so in the grand scheme of your range, he's not really that worried about you showing up with aces. He more or less thinks that you have a bluff. So your raise pre-flop represents a bluff. And then if you're c-betting a huge percentage of the time, then your c-bet also represents a bluff. So even though you can have this uncapped range and he can't have a capped range, it's the same way that a bad aggressive player who's shipping all in, pre-flop every hand could potentially have aces, but he also just has so much garbage that you don't really worry about him having aces very much. So in this sense, when we're playing, especially against like thinking players or good aggressive players or whoever, we have to be very conscious of the fact that we are like probably starting off when we're raising pre-flop. We're likely to be starting off in a position where we are somewhat unbalanced. And against a thinking player, we need to be aware that just because we're being aggressive doesn't mean we're representing a strong hand. And so in that sense, you have to consider what position you're in. So if I'm like on the button, I have to be sort of reducing my c-bet percentage against thinking players and certainly against bad aggressive players if I'm opening that wide. Whereas if I'm opening under the gun, I might be able to maintain a pretty heavy or pretty like high c-bet percentage just because I'm not going to have that many bluffs in my range pre-flop in general, which means that my opponent's capped range becomes sort of more important in that sense. So the answer is these. You can't really say exactly how often to c-bet, but you can say how often to think about c-betting or what to think about when c-betting, and sort of these are the things: player type, board texture, thinking about your equity. Obviously, the more equity you have, the more likely it is that you're going to win the pot, the more you can kind of get away with thinner bluffs. And remember, c-betting is bluffing. And then last but not least, sort of beware of being too unbalanced, especially in terms of bluffs if you're like raising on the button or something along those lines. Okay. The next segment of this is talking about how do we play against c-bets. So remembering now that a c-bet is not anything crazy, it's not magical, it's just a bluff like many other types of bluffs. What do I do against somebody who is playing or who is c-betting against me? So the first thing to think about is connecting the pre-flop ranges to the post-flop ones. So if your opponent is opening 100% on the button and you're in the big blind defending with something, just because let's say you have like, I don't know, Queen 10, the board comes down like King, Queen 3. Just because he can have a lot of kings, maybe all of the kings in his range, doesn't mean that it's very likely that he has a king. Certainly doesn't mean it's very likely he has aces. It's possible. Sometimes he will have aces, but not very often compared to all the other random things that he might have. So the first thing to think about is, how wide is my opponent's range? And then if you tie that to the c-bet percentage, you could say, and then how wide is my opponent's range for c-betting the flop? Now, I'm very sort of skeptical of some of these statistics because somebody's c-bet percentage will depend a lot on history, depend on relationships, on table dynamics for sure. But as a general sort of idea, if somebody has a really high c-bet percentage and a really, really wide opening range, it's pretty likely that they are just having bluffs a huge portion of the time. And when your opponent has a giant percentage of bluffs, it's kind of a mistake to fold. So what do you do when your opponent has a wide range pre-flop and a high c-bet percentage? How do you proceed? Well, assuming that you don't make a hand, and we're sort of talking about, obviously it's easier when you have a kind of a good hand, but what happens when you miss the flop also? Well, if you decide to rebluff, which could be a really good idea, you're oftentimes getting a pretty good price to do it. Basically, you have a couple of options on that one street, which is that you could raise now as a bluff, or you could float and try to bluff later on. Floating meaning like calling the bet and sort of seeing what happens on the turn. Now, the truth is that there are more options than that because your float could be a float to try to raise the turn, or a float to fold the turn to a bet, or just to bet the turn if he checks to you. Or the float could be to call the turn and then raise the river, or to fold the river but bet if he checks to you. Or to do any of those things. Or on any of those streets or situations, the bet that you could choose or the raise size you could choose could be large or small. I mean, there's many, many ways you could decide to be bluffing against the c-bet. But again, we have to be very cautious about being unbalanced, especially the wider that our ranges are. So one of the problems with, let's say, playing well, so when you're in the big blind and the small blind opens with a very wide range and you defend with a very wide range, is that everyone kind of knows that you have a really wide range. It's hard for anyone to really represent like value hands. In fact, at this point, it's actually like somewhat easier for the guy in the small blind to represent a lot of value hands, simply because the ranges are both so wide that the fact that he can have aces and you can't now starts to like maybe be a little bit more influential. Because your range is just as wide as his is, except it doesn't include as many strong things. So again, we have to be very, very aware of unbalance, not just on his side, how often is he over bluffing, but also on our side, are we overcompensating by playing against by trying to bluff back against somebody too often? Now, in small stakes games in general, I would say it's much more common for people to not be bluffing as often as we think, and so we tend to accidentally unbalance ourselves towards bluffing in these playing against c-betting spots, in spots where somebody's pre-flop range is actually not that wide. If the pre-flop range is narrow, you really don't have too much of a business trying to bluff in general, just because they're going to have a strong hand or a strong equity hand a little bit too often to make that too good of an idea. However, there's another type of unbalance, and you see this more. This is probably more for like the mid-stakes and high-stakes crowd, but sometimes you'll see what I would describe as unusual behavior. So this would basically be a pre-flop raiser checking. The least unusual would be check folding as the pre-flop raiser. The medium unusual would be check calling as the pre-flop raiser. And the maximum unusual would be check raising as the pre-flop raiser. But they're all options and they can all be done. So how do those affect what somebody's c-betting range might look like? Well, to start off with, if they are, let's say, check folding a lot, that immediately means that their range is stronger, obviously, because they are removing some of the bluffs out of their c-betting range. So when I talk about like managing or balancing your range, what I mean in a lot of cases is, not is doing stuff like checking back as the pre-flop raiser or checking it and just giving up from time to time to make sure that you are not over bluffing in a specific spot. Now, again, for the small stakes crowd, in a passive game, you're just probably going to want to keep c-betting just because people are just going to keep folding to you. But when somebody starts checking as a pre-flop raiser and giving up, it's usually a decent indicator that they are actually like thinking about their range and are probably halfway decent. On the other side of this is somebody who, let's say, check calls as the pre-flop raiser. This actually is interesting because this actually has the opposite effect of weakening your opponent's c-betting range. So if somebody, let's say, takes a hand like Jack 10 on a Queen 10-4 board and decides to check call with it, that means that they're not c-betting a lot of their medium pairs. They may not even be c-betting some of their like weaker queens, which means that while their checking range is certainly becoming more balanced, their c-betting range is probably becoming a lot more bluff heavy because they're not betting some of those like hands that are likely to be the best hand, and so are more likely to be betting like a lot of their bluffs, or sort of more bluffs than they have actual made hands in that event. So in general, watching for unusual behavior like that will help you get a good sense of how to play against c-bets beyond kind of what the basic stats will tell you, which is like somebody's pre-flop raising percentage, and then somebody's continuation of aggression or their c-bet percentage. So where do we go from here? Well, I would encourage everybody here to do what I would call keeping the long view, which is basically to say that c-betting has, through like countless videos and books and experience, has kind of been ground into you as like a way to win a quick buck. And it's very much a short-term thing. It's like, okay, if I c-bet this, I can win now, scoop some money, keep it going, so on and so forth. This is definitely good against bad passive players. So I say we can defeat bad passive opponents through methodical aggression. Just raise and c-bet, 3-bet, c-bet, just keep taking it down. that's not the way that we can beat players who are aggressive. And obviously, as the games have been getting tougher and as you've been moving up in stakes, you've been noticing that people are becoming more aggressive, folding to your c-bets less often, and things have become more challenging. So we beat bad passive players by c-betting, but we beat bad aggressive players not by c-betting, but by minimizing our waste, keeping the pots as small as possible until we make a good hand, and then bloating the pots as large as possible with our opponents who don't like to fold. Against thinking opponents, we can defeat them by kind of manipulating or managing your range in such a way that you're not likely to be exploited until you figure out sort of what you want to do against them in general. So as far as c-betting goes, this often means doing things like check folding as the pre-flop raiser, like check calling, with some portion of your range, or check raising even. I think is something that's going to come into vogue pretty soon as the pre-flop raiser. I can see a lot of benefits to doing that. Basically, controlling your range in such a way that you don't get unbalanced and tip too far in one direction or the other. That said, if you're observing, you'll see many of your opponents, especially kind of in the small to mid-ish stakes, who don't do a great job of managing their range, who are way too bluff heavy. And against those types of players, we can really take advantage of them by kind of counter bluffing. Now, going on for next time, we're going to talk a lot more about how to use board texture to develop a bluffing plan across multiple streets. So if I'm starting pre-flop and then I get to the flop and I see this board, how do I actually go about planning out a bluff in such a way? And we'll do that on both sides, where it's, let's say that I am like the one who's being aggressive first. How do I plan out those things? And then how do I plan out a bluff if I am the one sort of receiving the aggression? We sort of mentioned floating here today. We didn't really get too much into flop raising. I wonder if I should actually maybe next time start off doing flop raising before we get into some of the turn play. We're going to sort of, the series is going to have us kind of move through from week to week, going through each part of the hand. So we've sort of done pre-flop, and now this is sort of c-betting on the flop. I guess you should probably do flop raising and then sort of planning out turns and things like that. Obviously, there are so many different iterations, and the decision trees can go pretty far. But it's sort of good to take this one step at a time and look at these as individual microcosms. Anyway, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this. This has been kind of a fun, challenging mental series for me to fully wrap up and put together. But I would say this: you don't need to win every pot. C-betting sometimes feels like it's your way to win the pot, but the goal of poker is not to win pots, it's to win money. So keep that in the back of your head, and sort of be conscious of your c-betting plan when you're going into it. And with that said, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this has been interesting. This has been Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman, only here on DeucesCrack.com. I will see you guys next time. Good luck.